You're listening to Jason Lee Willis's Examining Moses, Episode 4, Mo Better Blues. So baby Moses grew up and lived happily ever after, until he killed a guy. The details of Moses' life from the age of 3 months to 40 are fairly limited, and initially seem problematic for creating a whole chapter. It only took a little prying to discover that there were all sorts of intriguing problems and situations that would have faced Pharaoh Akhenaten, Queen Nefertiti, and Prince, what should we call him? Moses or Drew, for his name was I Drew Him Out of the Water. Hollywood filled this void with make-believe plots about conflict between Moses and his foster brother. The timeline for the 18th dynasty, however, has Ramses coming to power at the age of 16, when Moses is 80, so not rivals. Also, if indeed it is the court of Akhenaten, then there were no sons anyway, thus, baby Drew. There are 2 spots in the Bible that amplify what happened when Princess drew the Hebrew baby from the water. The first verse comes from Luke the Researcher, which isn't, of course, a real title. Luke 7, verse 20. In which time Moses was born, and was exceedingly fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up, and nourished him for her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. So, pretty close to what we got in Exodus. Beautiful baby? Check. 3 months old? Check. Pharaoh's daughter? Check. But I still think daughter-in-law. Took him as her own son? Check. Now, verse 22 is where things get amplified. Nefertiti did not just use him as an emotional blanket to compensate for her inability to produce a male child for her husband. Luke implies that Moses was educated also. Now, why would you do that? If he was just a human doll, you could keep him dumb, like a court jester. What need did her baby doll have for an education, especially a slave baby? If you compare this with any other daughter in the 18th dynasty, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. For Nefertiti, it makes a lot of practical sense. She has daughters who are spiritually capable of becoming queen. Thanks to Amenhotep III, a new policy exists that allows royal daughters to marry non-royal men. Moses could marry one of her daughters and rule. Remember, she is trying to steal power from Team Thebes and return it to Team Delta. Without a son, her daughters might be forced to marry a Theban, and then the control of Egypt would return to those southern rednecks. Nefertiti does not want this to happen. So not only is Moses an emotional answer to her prayers, but she immediately sees him as a political answer to them as well. According to my Oxford timeline, Nefertiti would become queen when Moses was 5 years old. It does appear that Moses stayed with Nefertiti during these formative years, and when Moses turned 5, Queen Nefertiti could have lavished him with all the wisdom of the Egyptians. But what does all the wisdom of the Egyptians mean? Have you seen the topics about Egypt covering on the History Channel? Did the ancient Egyptians understand astronomy? Yep. Did they understand math to build pyramids? Yep. Was history important to the Egyptians? Yes. Did the Egyptians trade with the rest of the world by land and sea? Of course. Did the Egyptians have literature and the arts? Yep. Heck, the Egyptians even invented beer, Moses could have been given all of these wisdoms. What was Moses' language? Did he speak Hebrew or Egyptian? Luke says Moses was mighty in words and deeds. Yet by the time he is 80, Moses balks at God's plan to say, "Let my people go," because what? What happened to Moses' training, his gift with words? Consider that his native language might have been Egyptian instead of Hebrew. This could cause him issues, right? He lived with Egyptians his first 40 years, and then he lived with Midianites the next 40. He went 80 years since he was hanging around Hebrews on a daily basis. Yes, it could have been a psychological or physical issue, but being raised in the Egyptian education system might have caused this issue. If Nefertiti wanted to restore a Delta dynasty, Moses could be her instrument. She was building the perfect prince. Luke implies that Moses was mighty indeed as well, but we're going to table that for a few moments. I finished episode 3 with a theory on why Nefertiti could have been a spiritual ally for Moses and the Hebrews. And nowhere else in the totality of Egyptian history has there been a spiritual upheaval than those during the time of Nefertiti's reign. A bit about Aten. If Team Delta already had a triad and creation story similar to Elohim and Adam, then evangelizing could have easily happened. Nefertiti did not just pick up the baby, straight arm Miriam, and run into the palace away from Jochebed, which her name can be found in Exodus 6:20. She brought Jochebed to her house and even paid her for nursing. Did Miriam get to come as well? Aaron and Amram? It doesn't say. Without an answer or explanation, all I can do is look at what happened in Egypt during the youth of Moses and deduce the answers. Here is a quick timeline. What was going on for Moses? So when Moses was 3 months old, this would have been where Moses was rescued by Nefertiti. At 5 years of age would have been when Amenhotep III died. Also at the age of 5 would have been when Amenhotep IV takes the throne. That would have been his foster father. From the ages of 5 to 10, Egyptian history records that Amenhotep begins to promote the Atum triad. However, when Moses would have been 10 years old, Amenhotep IV changes his name to Akhenaten. Now, when Moses was 14, Akhenaten bans all other worship but worship of the Aten. And of course, when Moses was the ripe old age of 22 years, Akhenaten dies suddenly. Because the worship of Aten was abolished and obliterated by later pharaohs, Horemheb through Ramses the Great, the religion of this time period is only coming to light in the last century or so. As a result, theorists vary wildly. I've seen some that characterize Akhenaten as the precursor of the Antichrist, while others credit him for inventing God as a monotheistic entity. Here's what I do know. Ramses hated it. Horemheb hated it. As a result, Nefertiti was hated also. And Egyptian records of Hebrews and Moses, they don't exist. I think the forces of good and evil stand on opposite sides during this era. So, what is it? For 2,000 years of worship, Ra was the predominant sun god in the pantheon of Egyptian gods. There were already minor gods to explain other aspects of heat also. Yet, during this time period, Aten comes out of the blue to become the official state religion during the reign of Akhenaten. The basic concept of Aten versus Ra is that Aten is light instead of the sun. In the surviving art that we found, the hands of Aten touch all of creation with little cupped hands. He has no graven animal images or symbols. Aten is good. Yep, that's all, folks. Amenhotep IV could easily have worshipped Ra, Sekhmet, Horus, Khepri, or Atum if he just wanted to worship the sun or light. Instead, he promotes something new, and then he banishes all the old worship. This is a very bold move, even for dudes who think they are deities. Yes, he renames himself after Aten, but most pharaohs already did name variations. He wanted Aten to be worshipped, and there were no other gods. Monotheism, arrogance, insanity, true believer. My theory is that Aten might have been a poor attempt at promoting the Hebrew God. Nefertiti could already have been influenced by the Hebrews while living in Goshen. We saw how open-minded Amenhotep IV / Akhenaten was to her religion over his Theban gods, and if Moses or Miriam or Jochebed had his ear, he could have easily changed his views again. Moses, as a 10-year-old preacher, is a bit out of reach, but it is possible. So too is Hebrew influence via Moses' family members. Regardless, Akhenaten changes teams, bans other gods, and begins building a new center of worship called Amarna. That's bold. The name Aten simply means disk. And considering the Egyptians were the first to draw something that looked like a halo, there is nothing spooky or sinister about it yet. Let's visualize the conversion of Amenhotep IV for a bit. So, Amenhotep IV. So tell me about your God, Moses. Moses. Well, he is the creator and the only true God. He created everything. How did creation start? One day, let there be light. And what does your God look like? Not sure. We don't make graven images of him. And his name? In the days before the flood, men invoked his name, but we've been careful and reverent not to use the name since those days. We keep it pretty generic. So no proper name like Ra, Osiris, Horus. You do know how important names are to the Egyptian concept of immortality. To convert others, we're going to need to call the God of Abraham something cool. No proper name? Nope. But if I ever get an opportunity, I will ask God what he'd like to be called. I'm betting he will have rules about using the name, though. So Amenhotep IV calls his new monotheistic light god Aten. Decades later, Moses does in fact get a chance to ask God his name. God's response? I am who I am. Was God being snarky or serious? Did he dodge the answer or give him a specific title? Well, let's look at what Moses wrote down. Yes, Moses did write the Hebrew phrase YHWH, which the Hebrews refused to use with the vowels. What did they say out loud? Adonai. What did the vowels create? Yahweh is the most popular translation. What does it mean? I am. But Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible after this conversation, does not use one name. Instead, he uses all sorts of different names, ranging from Elohim to El Shaddai. Seriously, you could write a book on all the name variations and titles used for God in the Bible. Moses asked the question, but the implied answer did not fit the proper name concept. So, using Aten as a word for God is no different than using the English words Almighty, Lord, or Creator. My misguided point is that while Moses was in the Egyptian court, the religion of the Egyptians veered dramatically closer to the biblical God and was then crushed by the same people who wanted to kill Moses. Too good to be true, which is why it all fits for me. Moses and Merit sitting in a tree. So yes, it is just a theory of mine that Nefertiti would have saved Moses so that he could marry one of her biological daughters to secure the throne for Team Delta. It is conjecture that she trained Moses in words and deeds, still more of the deeds part later, so that he could be the perfect prince for her daughter. Yet, there is a very intriguing verse about Moses from the writer of Hebrews. 11:23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith, Moses, when he was come 2 years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater than the riches and treasures in Egypt. For he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned. The writer of Hebrews confirms the common belief about Moses centuries after his death. So I put the whole thing in there at this point. Depending on your translation, this section has some pretty intriguing phrases. First, it does imply that Moses had faith as a young man. His years of Egyptian education did not brainwash him into idolatry. It even builds on what kind of faith he had by suggesting that he was not only an Old Testament Godfellow, but that he believed in the whole thing, including the promise of the coming Christ. It was because of Christ that Moses refused his Egyptian identity. But what exactly was he refusing? Pleasure? Sin? Riches? Being called son? Certainly, it is possible that he just rebelled against his foster family and wanted to be Team Hebrew. But I think he rebelled for a very specific reason: marriage. In researching the timeline for the reign of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, there are some key moments in their history. Now, we've already talked about the religious upheavals they promoted, but there are some minor details happening in the court that have long-term impacts. First, Nefertiti's brother, Sminkari, who was a major player in Team Delta, was married to her daughter, Merit Aten. If you ever wondered why we have such specific moral codes written in the book of Leviticus, this is probably your answer. Yes, Uncle Smen married his niece, Merit. Ew. At the same time period, another critical event happens. Akhenaten takes on a second wife, Kia. Now, Queen Nefertiti keeps her crown and her royal daughters, and her brother/son-in-law, Smen, but Akhenaten realizes he needed to take another wife in order to produce a male heir. What suddenly happened? Was the heat on from Team Thebes? After all, Akhenaten's royal sister, Menajme, had married a non-royal Theban by the name of Horemheb. If Akhenaten died, he would have no legal heir, and the wealth would revert back to his sister and brother-in-law, Horemheb. Or was there another reason? One of the reasons why I do advocate Ramses the Great as the Pharaoh of Exodus is that everything in the 18th dynasty seems to match up so well. Here's another instance. How old would Moses have been when this happened? 17. Is that what the Hebrews author meant when Moses was come to age? It was time to get married? Nefertiti's careful plan was about to save the day. An educated, sophisticated, adoptive Hebrew son would marry her daughter, Meritaten, and they would have the power to steal the throne away from Team Thebes. At first, Moses would just be a prince, but when foster dad dies, Moses and Merit could claim the throne of Egypt ahead of Horemheb. Problem solved. Thanks, but no thanks. What? Can you imagine the chaos and turmoil Moses would have caused by rejecting this marriage? He would have officially joined the 18th dynasty. Son. He would have become the legal heir of foster dad, and rich. He would have married a princess. Pleasure. He would have grown up as brother and sister. Ew, sin. Why would Moses say no to the nice lady who plucked him from the Nile? Christ. Yep, Moses says no on principle. This leaves Nefertiti scrambling. To help Team Delta stay in power, she takes her own daughter and marries her to her brother. Since she is not producing a male heir, she might have hatched the plan to bring in Kia, kind of the same thing as Sarah did with Hagar. Her handmaiden could give her a son, and then she could make another Moses clone, marry the boy to one of her younger daughters, and bam, Team Delta rules. Thanks to Moses, it all falls apart quickly. Kia does have a child, whom they call Tut. Yes, that Tut. Within 5 years of the marriage refusal, Akhenaten dies. The throne passes to Uncle Smen and Merit, but they rule for less than a year. Then the throne is given to the boy king, Tutankhamun, who was advised by Vizier I, Nefertiti's dad. Team Delta is suddenly very weak. I think it is time for another recap of how old Moses is during these events. So just a couple reminders. At 3 months old, Moses is rescued by Nefertiti. At 5 years of age, Amenhotep III dies, which is the same time that Amenhotep IV takes the throne. The ages of 5 to 10 years, Amenhotep promotes the worship of the Atum triad. When Moses was 10, Amenhotep IV changes his name to Akhenaten. At the age of 14, Akhenaten bans all other worship but Aten. Now, when Moses was 17, this would have been when Smenkhare marries Meritaten. Also at the same time when Moses was 17, Akhenaten IV takes on another wife, Kia. And in that same time period when Moses was 17, baby Tut was born. And at the same time, when Moses was 17, it records there were minor military engagements. Now, jumping ahead, at the age of 22, Akhenaten dies suddenly. At the same age, Smenkhare becomes pharaoh. A year later, Smenkhare dies suddenly, and when Moses was 23 years old, his little foster brother, King Tut, becomes pharaoh as a boy. Chaotic times in Thebes, huh? Now, There's something I wanted to get back to that was mentioned in Luke 7:22. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. Words and deeds. What are these deeds that Luke referenced? Biblically, you'd have to pick the stuff from age 80 to 120, which was a pretty impressive list of deeds. Yet Luke was talking about Moses and his training. So what deeds? The Hebrew historian Josephus provides all sorts of insight. First, let's talk about Josephus. He is not infallible, but he does give good insight into what folks believed in the era of Christ. He supports a non-Ramses timeline with the princess named Thermusis pulling Moses from the water. He supports a short 430 years in Egypt with a direct tree from Amram to Levi. So Josephus muddies the waters a bit. Sorry about the Nile pun. According to Josephus, Moses' understanding, quote, became superior to his age, unquote. He also, quote, discovered greater quickness of apprehension, unquote, and that they were, quote, surprised at the beauty of his countenance, unquote. Later, in Josephus' chapter 10, Josephus describes how Moses became a general and was sent to deal with the Ethiopians in the distant lands of Aksum. If this aligns with the minor military engagements described during the reign of Akhenaten, then at 17, Moses might have performed his first miracle. Josephus describes how young Moses uses a, quote, wonderful demonstration of sagacity and employs stratagem to help defeat the Ethiopians with great slaughter. He not only defeated the invaders, but he pushed them all the way back to their cities, which he besieged. During one of the fights at the city walls, Moses apparently impressed the Ethiopian princess Tharbis, who, quote, fell deeply in love with him. Instead of sacking the city, Moses made a marriage alliance with Miss Tharbis, and after accepting surrender, quote, consummated this marriage, all at the age of 17. Now, I'm not sure if this tale should happen before or after the rejection of Nefertiti. If it happened before, then it gives him a reason to reject Meritaten. Sorry, Ma, I got married to Tharbis while I was away. If this happened prior, then he would have returned to Thebes as a hero, beloved by all Egyptians, except, of course, General Horemheb. General Moses could marry Princess Merit as a reward for his service. If it happened after, then he is being punished. He is being thrown to the dogs. General Horemheb and the Thebans could get rid of Moses and weaken Team Delta. Akhenaten and Nefertiti would have been insulted by his rejection and might have wanted him out of their sights. Go to Ethiopia. Yet, look at how power shifted suddenly. With his marriage alliance to Tharbis, Moses now has two armies. If foster dad did indeed make him commander of the armies of Upper Egypt, then he now has the power of Ethiopia also. Team Delta and the Hebrews are plentiful in the north, leaving Team Thebes sandwiched in the middle. Nefertiti would have been pleased. But Tharbis is a made-up story, right? Moses lives happily ever after with Zipporah, the gal from the well in Midian, right? Unfortunately, there isn't much about Tharbis. Did he have a one-night stand and then forget about her? Did he bring her back? Heck, Moses could have an heir in Aksum. Strangely, there is a reference to Tharbis in the Bible. Numbers 12, verse 1. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married. For he had married an Ethiopian woman. So they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?" And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. Quick recap here. Moses is 81-ish, and we've had the 10 plagues, the Red Sea, and the 10 Commandments by this point. Aaron and Miriam, his Hebrew siblings, are in their late 80s and have spent a year in the wilderness. The people are restless and questioning the leadership of Moses. In their jealousy, Aaron and Miriam bring up a scandal from 6 decades earlier as proof of Moses' fallibility. It was an old sex scandal. Now, God puts Aaron and Miriam in their place and reconfirms Moses as the righteous authority in the camp. What does this mean about Tharbus? It was not a fling. It was a legit marriage? Was Tharbus dead by the time Moses married Zipporah? Only God knew the truth, and Miriam was speaking from a position of ignorance. A Game of Thrones. Even though Moses did not marry Merit-Aten, he would have remained a powerful man in Thebes when he returned. In a way, he was in the middle of 2 powerful houses. Yes, the Hebrews were slaves, but there were 1 million of them along the Nile, especially in the Delta. Now, Moses also has another powerful minority, the Ethiopians. Team Delta recap. So, Queen Nefertiti has the most clout, but she has infused the court with her Deltans. Her father Ai was vizier, and her brother Sminkari has just married her daughter, Merit-Aten. With other daughters, she can further strengthen Team Delta before anything happens to her husband. She is playing the endgame. Team Thebes recap. General Horemheb is the most powerful person around, even though he is not a royal. He did marry Mudnajme, who was the daughter of Amenhotep III and sister to the current king. Because of her divine blood, he rises to the rank of commander of the armies of Lower Egypt, which is large to maintain the Hebrew slaves and fight off any threats from the Middle East. His southern allies include 2 military men, Ramses I and Seti I. After biting their tongues for 17 years, Akhenaten dies. Score update. Nefertiti 0, Horemheb 1. Now, Horemheb jumped off the page for me. He was unlike any other pharaoh of his day, and his motivations really seemed to match the situation in which Moses found himself when he killed a man. So, after one of the most turbulent reigns Egypt has seen in centuries, Akhenaten dies, leaving the future of Egypt in turmoil. For the promoters of Aten, everything is in jeopardy. For Moses, his position as prince and general are in jeopardy. For the Hebrews, who are slaves working for the 18th dynasty, freedom is in jeopardy. Team Delta versus Team Thebes is about to begin. Now, I'm not sure how it happened, but Sminkari becomes pharaoh, and I have to assume it is because he married the divine daughter Merit-Aten. Akhenaten's only biological son, Tut, is not even close to being old enough to hold court, so Nefertiti turns to her brother, whom she can trust. He'd been part of the rule of Egypt, but was also a Deltan, meaning Nefertiti pulled a bit of a coup. Nefertiti remained queen regent, while her daughter became queen and her brother became pharaoh. With Moses commanding the armies of Upper Egypt, as well as being a prince of Ethiopia through his marriage to Tharbus, Nefertiti holds all the cards. Score update: Nefertiti 1, Horemheb 1. However, Horemheb is a bit of a sinister fellow, and he begins a Richard III purge of the 18th dynasty. As the religious and cultural enemy of Akhenaten, many historians speculate Horemheb might have hastened his death. Despite being a middle-aged man, Pharaoh Smenkhare only rules for a year before he dies. Score update, Nefertiti 1, Horemheb 2. By this time, Nefertiti's surrogate son, Tut, is older and is forced to marry his older sister, Akhesenaten. Why? She's Team Delta, old enough to manipulate her husband and a close ally of Nefertiti. Even though Tut was born to a surrogate mother, Kia, it is Nefertiti who has controlled court since he was alive. Horemheb had a minor win by getting a regent who is both Team Delta and Team Thebes. So, scoring update, Nefertiti 1.5, Horemheb 2.5. However, young Tut quickly sides with Team Delta, picking Nefertiti's father, Ai, as his vizier. He also continues promotion of Aten and honors his father. During this time period, Moses would have been in his prime, his late 20s and early 30s. Did this warrior general influence young Tut? Or was Moses far off in Ethiopia or fighting battles on the edges of the Egyptian frontier? Either way, Queen Regent Nefertiti is catching up. Score update, Nefertiti 2, Horemheb 2.5. Things were good for the first few years, but by Tut's third year of rule, he began to shift his allegiances towards his general, Horemheb. He changes his name to Tutankhamun, lifts the ban on Amun and the gods of Team Thebes, and returns worship to Thebes instead of Amarna. Tut also has a Theban tax master named Maya, who helps suppress the Hebrew people and the threat posed by Moses. To counter this, Ai remarries a royal daughter to secure his future place. Scoring update, Nefertiti 2, Horemheb 3. When the sickly Tut dies, control of Egypt is once again up in the air. Tut did not produce any heirs, but somehow Nefertiti again manipulates things so that her own father, Ai, the vizier of Egypt, ends up ruling Egypt. At this time, Moses is 32 years old. If he'd given Nefertiti her wish, he would have been pharaoh with Meritaten during all of this upheaval. Did he remain an active part in court? Who knows? Scoring update, Nefertiti 3, Horemheb 3. Despite tying things up, Nefertiti has played her last card. Her father Ai was old and did not produce an heir. He did manage to rule for 5 years, although historians are very unclear if Ai was just a puppet. When Ai does die, Nefertiti and Horemheb came to some sort of truce. It was decided that Tut's widow, who died without an heir, should return as Queen Akhesenaten. This childless widow rule, which you can see in Deuteronomy 25, 7-9, is seen in our Bible with the story of Tamar, Genesis 38. In the story, Judah is expected to provide a husband for Tamar since she died without a child or son to take care of her. It was your legal obligation. For Nefertiti, this is a win because Akhesenaten is her biological daughter. For Horemheb, this is a win because the husband could be a Theban or a stranger who could be neutral. Word is spread throughout the land and neighboring countries that the hand of the queen could be purchased with a big dowry. As a result, princes come from near and far with carts of treasures to woo Tut's widow. And then Horemheb kills them all. Score update, Nefertiti 3, Horemheb 4. Yep, the mask comes off. Horemheb is the villain, and he owns it. In killing all the suitors, he fired a warning shot to all the neighboring countries to not mess with Egypt. It also leaves his house wealthy. In this moment, he uses his marriage to Mudnajme, who is the sister of Akhenaten III, who is the daughter of Akhenaten III and sister of Amenhotep IV, to supersede all those with Deltan blood to produce a pure-blood Theban marriage. Killing the suitors must have been quite a coup, and I'm not sure if Team Delta was impacted. Based on Moses' presence, I think Horemheb only took out the suitors, left Nefertiti and the Deltans alone. He surrounds himself with more Thebans, promoting Ramses I as his vizier, and naming Ramses' son, Seti, as the new commander of the armies of Lower Egypt, who can now further oppress the Hebrew workforce, as well as the private holdings of Team Delta. Moses might still be the commanders of the upper army of Egypt and a prince of Ethiopia, but only because he is a dangerous foe. Score update: Nefertiti 3, Horemheb 5. At 37, Moses has some choices in front of him. Once Horemheb takes control, he immediately begins to implement a very pro-Egyptian, anti-others series of policies. He returns traditional worship and begins to dismantle everything done at Amarna. Although his old wife cannot produce an heir, he places his Theban friends in a position to rule after he is gone. If the Hebrews and Deltas are to continue to worship God, something needs to be done, and Moses is the last chance for Nefertiti. Moses messes up. So, it's time to go back to the Bible. We've all read the story, but let's look at it in a different light. Moses grew up in Thebes. His Hebrew family lived upriver or South Thebes, and since being adopted into Team Delta, Nefertiti has kept him either in Thebes or down in Ethiopia. But most of the Hebrews are slaves way up north in the Delta. Exodus 2, verse 11. And it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw there was no man, he slew the Egyptian, and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to them that did the wrong, Wherefore smitest thou fellow? And he said, Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known. Unto his brethren? While there certainly were slaves in Thebes working on the Valley of the Kings, most slaves were in the land of Goshen, working in the brick factories in the muddy delta, right? What was Moses up to? Why would he make a multi-day, hundreds of miles trip up the delta? Moses is about to make a counter-coup. Think about it. If he could enlist the help of the Hebrew workforce in the delta, along with his marital alliances to Ethiopia, and his unclear military connections with the army of Upper Egypt, he could raise quite the sedition against a fascist tyrant like Horemheb. Wow, secret agent man. Instead of this scene just being an accident, what if it is a plot? He is down in the land of Goshen, stoking the fires of a rebellion, kills an Egyptian, and then learns that rumors of it have leaked. The rumor is a threat. Yes, the Hebrews have no reason to rat on Moses, but if they knew General Moses was there, Horemheb's spies might have learned also. Listen to what Josephus had to say about this time. Now the Egyptians, after they had been preserved by Moses, entertained hatred to him, and were eager in compassing their designs against him, as suspecting that he would take occasion, from his good success to raise a sedition and bring innovations into Egypt, and told the king that he ought to be slain. Sound like Horemheb, doesn't it? Yes, Moses would have earned the death penalty. During the reign of Horemheb, it was the death penalty for a foreigner to strike an Egyptian, and Moses did way more than that to the taskmaster in Goshen. According to Josephus, after the plot is discovered, quote, Moses went away privately, and because the public roads were watched, he took his flight through deserts, and where his enemies could not suspect he would travel, and thought he was destitute of food, and though he was destitute of food, he went on, and despised that difficulty courageously, and he came to the city Midian, which lay upon the Red Sea. Not suspect? Where could Moses run? Thebes? Nope. Team Delta is almost powerless. Not Goshen, where the murder most likely took place because that is the territory of General Seti. Not Nubia, nor Ethiopia, because he'd have to travel through Thebes, and they would look to assassinate him if he went to go get help from Tharbus. He went to Midian, where he could hide. We'll continue the story of Moses in episode 6, but his exile poses an interesting question for me. Why didn't he go back up to the Promised Land? Why didn't he go back to Canaan? I hope you've enjoyed episode 4 of Examining Moses by Jason Lee Willis. Check out my website or Facebook page, Jason Lee Willis Novels, for ordering the book or for more information. The music you've been listening to today was provided by YouTube's audio library. Until next time.